Good evening, and welcome to our February Music Forum. I'm Robert Taub, Director of Music at the Arts Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's also a distinct pleasure to welcome our very special guest artist, Katherine Bryer, a wonderful oboist. Katherine enjoys a distinguished career. Katherine, you've performed with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, the Philharmonia Orchestra, London Philharmonic Orchestra, amongst others. And I know that you're also passionate about solo and chamber music. And I guess you're a member of the Countess of Munster recital scheme. And we actually thank that trust for their cooperation in making this evening possible. So a very warm welcome to you, Katherine. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So you've prepared a wonderful program for this evening, a diverse program, works of Bach and Elliot, as well as Benjamin Britten. So spanning several centuries, really, and all for solo oboe. We'll get right to that, but I just thought it might be interesting for everyone to, let's just chat a little bit before we actually start playing. How, we're communicating via Zoom and people are logging in via YouTube and we're going to have a live performance, which is great, but we're still in lockdown. How has lockdown been treating you?
Well, I mean, it's had its difficulties, just like it has for everyone, I think. I mean, personally, I'm very lucky in that I'm safe and I'm well, and all my loved ones are safe and well too. But in terms of as a musician, it's been especially challenging because everything is, well, my entire diary was wiped from March 2020 until kind of now, basically. So there's been the odd things, but I just miss playing with people, really. And so it's really great that these kind of things can happen, and very convenient. I can just be in my living room and do it, so I don't have to go anywhere. But I'm looking forward to some return to normality, hopefully as soon as possible.
Well, I think we all feel the same way, and we're glad that you and everyone in your family as well, and we hope the same for everybody. I think we all miss the concert hall and the experience of sharing and communicating music in a live setting. So the fact that we're doing these streamings live rather than pre-recorded, I like the edge, and I think that it gives a little bit of the concept and the excitement of a true live performance, and we can't wait to get back to all of those. One other quick question, it's a little unusual to come across a solo oboist. I mean, there are fewer oboists than there are violinists and pianists. What attracted you to the oboe in the first place? And roughly, when did you start? How old were you?
So I started playing when I was about 14. And well, actually, slightly funny story. I used to be a tuba player, and in brass bands. And this is no disrespect meant to brass band music whatsoever, but I personally got a bit sick of playing the tuba and never getting to play the tune. So my auntie Alison, who might be watching, I'm not sure, she's an oboe player. And so I think I was just moaning to my parents about it so much that they were like, okay, well, Alison's got a spare oboe, she can give you some lessons. So after that, I kind of just got quite hooked on it. And then on the repertoire as well, and like orchestral music, because I'd not really encountered that before. And then it all sort of, kind of sped up from there, and I just worked really hard, and that's how I got into it.
Well, I would never have known that you were a tuba player. That's really interesting. And now you, rather than being the papa, you actually start off every orchestral concert with the tuning A. I mean, everyone knows that the oboe starts off the orchestra with that A. Why is that, actually? I've often wondered.
I think going way back when orchestras were still sort of, they were often like court musicians and that kind of thing. I think ensembles, it would usually be strings and then some oboes or stuff, or like horns and stuff. And just the nature of the sound is quite a piercing sound, so it can really carry across like all the other noise that's going on when instruments are tuning. And I think it's it's very piercing sound in a very sort of hopefully stable sound, very steady, where if you think of flute, there's a lot of sort of like frequencies, aren't there? But oboe is a bit more like direct. So I think it's quite good for sort of cutting through, and it's nothing to do with oboists being more in tune than other wind players. It's just the quality of the sound.
Well, it's the quality of the sound, and as you said, it's a very direct sound, and it's something that we've all come to rely upon. When we sit up a little bit more straight when the oboe plays the tuning A, which is good.
Yeah.
We're ready to go, and I think we're ready to go. The first piece that I think you were planning to share with us is the Bach partita. This is a partita in four, as all the partitas are, comprised of dance suites, right? So an allemande, a courante, and what else? We have sarabande, and then a more lively dance suite to end, the sarabande being the slow, expressive center, a more exuberant ending in a bourrée, but it's an English bourrée, is that right?
Yes, yeah, English bourrée, yeah.
So, well, let's dive right in. Originally, this was composed for flute, but transcribed for oboe. Is that
Well, I just play it off the flute part actually, because it works. The register's not, especially for Baroque flute, the register isn't so dissimilar to Monday oboe. So we just I think there is a version in G minor for oboe, but people don't play that so much. It's better to do it in the key that Bach wanted it in. Yeah.
A minor. Fantastic. Well, let's turn to the Bach partita in A minor. Thank you. Bravo. Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. You know, it's so wonderful to hear the purity of the Bach compositions. And what's amazing to me, no matter how many times you hear these works, they are fresh and vital. And I think the challenges which you overcame magnificently of playing a single line work, a monophonic work, with implied harmonies and complex counterpoint. Um, it's phenomenal what you do just with, you know, breath.
Yeah.
What are some of the tricks of the trade there?
Well, with the voicing and stuff, or just sort
Yeah,
of,
voicing and the different contrapuntal lines, and of course your use of dynamics was masterful, and phrasing, different contrasts of phrasing, particularly in the last bourrée. Um, it all creates a sort of compelling series of textures, musically integrated, of course, that you just want to keep on reveling in the sound.
yeah. Well, it's kind of, I guess, with the whole thing of it just being a single line instrument, I had spent a lot of time going through it, just like listening to recordings or just sort of going through it just on my own, kind of just picking out the different voices, because you need to sort of look for, yeah, where there's meant to be like a bass and then different kind of voices. Sometimes there's two voices, sometimes there's three voices. And yeah, you can do a lot with like the dynamics to bring that out. Like for example, with the bass notes, you're like, and then if you go up, just da 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 da, like, because if you went da 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 da, then you'd lose that sort of the voicing of it. And yeah, and the pacing of it and everything just sort of helps with that. And you kind of have to, because it's, I mean, if you look at the first movement, it's just a constant stream of semiquavers. So you kind of have to really, and also there's nothing marked. There's no dynamics, there's no articulation. So you have to really sort of make the space yourself and just sort of really sit with the piece for a long time, so that you can make these breaths, because obviously you can't do it all in one breath. So yeah, because I think I've been listening to all the violin partitas a lot, which I think he wrote this around the same time as them, and I don't know, just hearing, because I guess they can actually play more than one line, like they can play two strings and stuff. So just sort of getting in that sound world was really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And I would just like to remind everyone who's participating that so far it's just been Catherine and the two of us speaking and asking. I've been asking some questions, but we invite you for questions as well. There's a chat that's open in the YouTube channel, as well as the usual email address for questions that we will be very pleased to address toward the end of our session this evening. So you're absolutely right. Of course, the violins can, while they're more or less a monophonic instrument, they can play, you know, more than one sound at a time, obviously. But I know that we may hear some of that, those sort of wonderful harmonics in the Britten when we get to it toward the end. But you know, this Bach work, written I think in the 1720s, 1723-ish, 24, right at the heart of all of the other solo partitas that you alluded to. It's a magnificently rich work, and of course each of the four movements in this case has a very different character. The allemande is, you know, I believe, is meant to be intricate hand weavings, hence the never-ending stream of semiquavers, and the courante is more flowing, tiny little footsteps, as it were, in the courtly dances of the time. The only one that I understand to be sort of ancient even in Bach's day, or anachronistic in Bach's day, is a sarabande, which is harking back to a much earlier period and is more majestic. And the way you played it, I think, came across very beautifully. And as the expressive heart of the piece, that had some fantastically interesting chromatic harmonies, which if you excerpted, you wouldn't say, oh, that's Bach. You'd think, well, maybe that's, you know, Persichetti or some other 20th century composer. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the sarabande really is the sort of, because I think all the other movements are quite like, well, certainly the bourrée is very playful, but they're all quite sort of, yeah, flowing and moving. And then suddenly in the middle of it, you've got this really sort of quite intense, intense slow movement. And it's quite hard sort of switching, but you're in this sort of flowing, moving mode, and then you have to sort of just rein it all back in and completely change character. for that. But yeah, I love sarabands. I love playing sarabands. They're so beautiful. But I sometimes find them even harder than all the other kind of movements. Sometimes they're sort of getting the expression and everything.
Well, you've raised a very interesting point, and that is, the idea of a slower movement being harder than faster, more flowing types of music. To me, the challenge has always been you have a certain amount of time. If you were to take somewhat arbitrarily 30 seconds, and you play for 30 seconds of music, play 30 seconds of fast music, it seems like a lot is happening on the surface, right? Whereas if you play 30 seconds of a saraband, maybe not as much happens on the surface, but underlying that, there's got to be at least the same level of drama that's happening in that time, in that same, arbitrary time span. And I'm not saying this meant as any kind of artistic statement or experiment, but there have been times when I've made myself stop after 45 seconds or a minute of fast playing and then make myself go to a slow movement and try to imbue that with as much intensity, drama, whatever you want to call it, expression, as you can hear on the surface. So maybe, is that somewhat what you were thinking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're challenging in different ways, aren't they? Sort of, if you kind of, like you said, if you just take 30 seconds of a saraband, there's not so much going on in terms of the notes, but sometimes I feel like the control you need for a slow movement is even harder than for a fast movement. In some ways, like maintaining that line and sort of really having the direction and the sort of intensity behind it, and it's actually, and especially if you've just done all this fast playing before, then it can be quite challenging to sort of really get into that mode and change gear and everything. But yeah, I totally agree with what you were saying.
When you're changing gear in that way, how do you control your breath or your breathing? Because that's really the heart and soul of, I guess, some of the heart and soul of the way the oboe sounds, right?
Yes. I guess, well, you have to really work with any movement, slow movements, fast movements, whatever you do, you have to really have a really clear roadmap of where you're going to breathe. Because if you leave it to chance, you can end up sort of panicking a bit and just breathing in random places. So one of the first things I do when I'm sort of learning a piece or going through it is I figure out where is natural to breathe. Obviously it needs to make sense musically, finding a place where it's natural to breathe, and trying to take into account how tired I'll be by that point and those sort of things. So like in the Allemande, there were breaths I was taking at the beginning, and I think when I was first practicing, I was like, maybe I don't need these breaths. But then when I do the repeat, I'm like, yes, I really, really do need these breaths. So it's sort of, it's kind of using musical intuition, knowing where is good to breathe, but also practical and really marking it in. Like if you look at my music, it's just covered in pencil. So
that's part of the fun. Before you play for us the Carter piece, could you maybe just show everyone what the oboe really looks like? Hold it up and explain a little bit about how it works. How do you draw sound through the instrument? How do you make it sound as beautiful as you do?
Oh, sorry, I'll just give it a little clean out. So
sure. Well, tell us about what you're doing now too.
Oh, okay. So, well, when you play, obviously you have to blow down the oboe. That's how it makes the sound of it vibrate. Well, this is the reed, and you blow down the reed. That's the first thing, and that vibrates. So on its own, it just kind of sounds like that. So that then the airstream goes down the oboe, and then the whole wood of the oboe vibrates. But often, certainly with the first piece, your oboe is quite cold, and then you've got this hot air coming down it, so it can create quite a lot of water that can get caught in the keys. So and my oboe seems to be particularly problematic with catching water, so I just have to be quite careful to clean it out. So I'll just do that. So yeah, I have to put like a cigarette paper under some keys, oops, and then blow, and that kind of gets, sorry, I'm not in shot, and that kind of gets the water out. You can see it kind of comes out. Oh, sorry, it's a bit gross, but it's just condensation. So yes, so when I'll put it together. So this is what it looks like kind of close up. They're made of wood. Mine has actually got it's made of three three parts. You've got the bell, the middle joint, and the top joint. My top joint's actually made of plastic, but often they're made entirely of wood. So yes, and you have to, so you have to read, you have to, if you're sort of professional oboist, you have to learn to make these yourself, which is a whole other story. So then you put that in the top of the oboe. Oops. And then, so it needs, when you play the oboe, it takes quite like a sort of fast air pressure. It's not like if you've seen flute players, it's quite, there's no resistance in something like the flute and very little resistance in a clarinet as well, I think. Whereas with oboe, you're trying to like get air down this gap that you can't really see, this tiny, tiny, tiny gap. So there's so much resistance kicking back. So it takes quite a lot of control in that way. And you change, so basically, and the way you change note, you move the keys. It's a bit like, well, it's like a recorder. It's kind of a fancy recorder, basically. So the more keys that are down, the lower it is. And then as you shorten the amount of tube that's vibrating as you come up the instrument, that makes it go higher. So that's kind of a rough explanation of how the oboe works.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful explanation. How can you just give an idea for everyone, for us all to hear what the registral range is, essentially? The higher lows note.
So it doesn't, the oboe is it's one of the higher voiced members of the woodwind family. You've got like, so we sit in orchestra, we sit next to the flute, similar range to the flute, they can go much higher than us. And then, bassoons and clarinets behind, because they're the lower instruments. So the oboe can actually its lowest note is the B flat or A sharp below middle C. So it's really not very low, which is so it might sound low, but only because of the resonance of the instrument. But that's as low as we go. And then in terms of, it's got a rough sort of 2-octave range, but with some extended techniques like you'll hear in Elliot, and actually, which you heard in Bach, because this is originally for flute, it's got a top A in it, which is a very, very high. At the end of the Allemande, it had that really top note, and that's really, really top range for an oboe. You don't get that in most sort of standard repertoire. So the oboe kind of it's got a rough 2.5 octave range, which compared to something like the clarinet or I think even bassoon or certainly string players, it's not a huge range, but I think, I don't know, there's so much potential within the range we have. So I think it's fine, really.
Okay, that's wonderful. All right, let's jump into the, I guess, late 20th century with Elliot Carter. Before you play this piece, maybe we can talk about the man himself, the composer himself, and a little bit about the piece. So this work is called Inner Song. It's from a trilogy that he wrote for, he included harp in 2 of the other pieces in this trilogy. Is that correct?
Yes. So the first one is Barilage, I think, which is solo harp. Then it's solo oboe, and then duo in, what's the third? Imanoi, that's the third one. So he wrote them for, well, the oboe one is written for Heinz Holliger, who was a really influential, he's not dead. He is a very influential oboist, but certainly during the 20th century, like so much contemporary music was written for him, and his wife Ursula Holliger was an exceptional harpist as well, and I think they played a lot together. So actually a lot of oboe and harp repertoire from the 20th century was written for them, so we owe them quite a lot for that.
Great. Okay, so I think Carter wrote a couple of he wrote a little motto associated with this work.
Yeah, so he took the motto from Rainer Maria Rilke, his sonnet to Orpheus, or sonnet for Orpheus. So Rilke was a German early 20th century poet, and he wrote, I think, 2 books of about 20 sonnets after the myth of Orpheus. And he takes the last two stanzas from from number 10, book 2, for the whole trilogy, but for Inner Song specifically, this is the English translation. It said the motto that goes with it is "Words still peter out into what cannot be expressed." So it's kind of, and I think that kind of does catch the mood of the whole piece, because with Inner Song, it's just kind of, in some ways, actually, it's kind of similar to Bach. It's just this kind of unending line. It's this really long sustained line. that you have to sort of shape, and he has given clear instructions, but it's still a really long time to sort of keep the intensity in the sound. And I don't know, and there's extended techniques. He uses a full range of the oboe, so you hit really low, really high. So I don't know, I guess that's sort of, things that can't be expressed through words. You can do it through
Absolutely.
Techniques, yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so this is about a 6 or 7 minute piece. Elliot Carter died not too long ago. He was at least 101, possibly a little older. He lived in downtown New York in Greenwich Village. He was on the faculty of the Juilliard School for quite some time. He was a fantastic person, a wonderful inspirational composer, and wrote for solo instruments such as oboe as well as huge symphonic orchestras. So he had a very major influence and a great output of works over many decades. So please share this with us.
Great. Sorry, I'm just sort up the pages.
Wow. Thank you. Bravo. What a wonderful performance of a fantastic piece. Well done.
Thank you.
So it was, just to recap, it was Elliot Carter, Inner Song, composed 1992, I think,
Yeah,
solo oboe. It's the only work he wrote for solo oboe, is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, I think he wrote an oboe concerto.
Yes, he did.
But yeah, this is the only sort of unaccompanied thing we've got. But I love it. Yeah, I think it's an amazing piece.
It's extremely evocative, and the way you play it, I mean, you brought all of the extraordinary effects and the totality, the total, artistic experience from beginning to end was very, very compelling. So
Thank
well
you.
done. It's great. What's wonderful about bringing new music to life is that you play it as if it were old, and I mean that in the highest possible compliment. You play it with as much conviction as if it was already, well established, as if it's Bach, and or some other very well established composer who's already in the pantheon. And Carter, of course, deserves to be, and I'm sure will be. But many people probably haven't heard this piece yet. And so to play it with as much conviction as you would old music is really great. And then if you play old music with as much excitement and adventure as you bring to new music, that's also part of the fun, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, that's great. I'd like to ask you very briefly about one little point that you mentioned before we move on to the Benjamin Britten work. How do you make reeds? I mean, little
Well.
cat you just walk down to St. James's Park and pick a few out of the
No, it's a bit more. I mean, I could talk about this for probably like 2 weeks, so I'll make a condensed version of it.
Okay.
So there's various processes you have to go through before you end up with the thing that you put in the oboe. So, and some people do some things themselves and others they're not, but I'll just sort of explain exactly what I do. So I order tube cane. It kind of just looks like bamboo. Actually, I do have some in a box. Would you like to see it? I'll be back in a minute. It's just here. This is the benefits of being at home for these concerts. So I get a bag and it looks like this. So this is just the tube cane. And then I have to go put it through various processes so that it becomes in a sort of flatter shape. And then I have to put it through this machine and all these kind of things. And then I bind it on with thread. You can see the thread here. I bind it onto this cork thing, which we call a staple. And then when you have that, it's just a blank it's just a blank piece of cane. And then after that, you have to scrape it with a knife. So you put like a little thing in it to support it and you scrape it. And different oboists have different kinds of scrapes, and different countries have different sort of schools of plays. They have different kinds of scrapes, but you tend to do the way you scrape in the way your teacher taught you. So I kind of scrape in a similar style to my teacher from music college. Yeah, and it's quite, I mean, you play on bought reeds from like Howard's or from oboe shops until sort of last year of school. And then you sort of get to a certain level on the oboe, and then suddenly they're like, right, you have to make your own reeds, and you go back to sounding like a beginner because it's a whole different skill set to learn how to make these things. So no one tells you that when you first start the oboe, but it takes quite a lot of time. So you often have to spend as much time making a reed as you do practicing, because so much depends on the quality of your reed. Sure. So that's it.
And I imagine that when life gets back to normal and you go off to play a concert somewhere, you probably travel with more than one reed, just in case.
Yes, you should always really have several on the go and several at different stages, because they need time to like blow in, because it's a natural substance, it's a natural thing. It changes. So when you first make it, it will feel completely different a week later, which is a bit of a nightmare. So you always have to have different reeds, different stages. So that you don't get caught short, basically.
Yeah. Well, the notion of changing and changing over time can lead us very nicely into the Benjamin Britten Six Metamorphoses. Tell us a little bit about this piece and why you've chosen it.
So this piece, I mean, I'm kind of unlike Elliot Carter. It's a very staple piece of our repertoire. So almost every oboist will have played it since they were sort of at school, and I've certainly been playing them since I was at school. And I think quite rightly, because they're such evocative works, and they are just the way Britten writes for solo oboe, like the sort of different colours and stuff he manages to get out of the instrument. And I think people hadn't done it so much before. I think so. They were written in 1951, right, formed in 1952, and I think people hadn't really written for solo oboe before, and it really changed the game. I think that, like, internationally, they are very sort of established repertoire, which is really great. So these pieces, there's 6 metamorphoses after Ovid. So he wrote them. He chose 6 Greek characters from the metamorphoses, and wrote this piece inspired by them, and each one has a little bit of writing that comes with it. So I thought maybe I'd say that now rather than
sure.
I'm playing, perhaps maybe. So the first one is Pan, who he was I think he was like half goat, half man, I think. So Pan, and the writing here says, who played upon the reed pipes, which was Syrinx, his beloved. So this one is just meant to be very sort of free, kind of improvised sounding. It's like he's just sitting in a tree playing his reed pipe. So that's the first one. Then the second one, very different. We have Phaeton, who rode upon the chariot of the sun for one day and was hurled into the river Pados by a thunderbolt. So this one is, you kind of maybe imagine that as it's hearing very sort of bumpy kind of ride. Third one is Niobe, who, lamenting the death of her 14 children, was turned into a mountain. So this one is really quite sad, really, and it's so expressive. That's probably one of my favorites, Niobe, actually. It's so beautiful, and he writes at a key that's very sort of dark and covered on the oboe, so it works really well. Number 4 is Bacchus, who at the feast is heard the noise of gagging women's tattling tongues and the shouting of boys. So I think everyone's just at a party where we'd all like to be if it weren't for COVID. Everyone's at a party and they're just having a really good time. So that's kind of the mood of that one. Number 5 is Narcissus, who fell in love with his own image and became a flower. That's a very famous myth. I think that one, isn't it? And with this one, Britten he writes sort of 2 lines. So one is meant to be Narcissus himself, and then this other one comes in. You'll be able to hear it's a very different sort of color, and it's meant to be the reflection of Narcissus, and they gradually become one as the piece goes on. And then finally, we have Arethusa, who, flying from the love of Alpheus, the river god, was turned into a fountain. And this one is just sort of, it's like a waterfall all the way through. It's really beautiful. Yeah.
Fantastic. Look forward to hearing it. So if you're able to, that's a wonderful description, and thank you for sharing the character vignettes for each one. If you're able to perform it for us now, that would be fantastic.
I'm just going to clean my oboe out again.
Okay, that's absolutely great.
Yes.
And so while you're doing that, I guess the reeds themselves have somewhat of a limited lifetime. I mean, you have to go from one, and then when you feel that the performance is slipping, you move to the next one. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's exactly why you need to make sure you have different ones at different stages, so that because you don't want to have loads of old ones that then suddenly die, and then you've only got a brand new one which isn't quite settled yet. But so actually, to be honest, one nice thing about COVID is I haven't actually missed having to constantly be making reeds. It's been quite nice it's been nice to just play and not worry too much about the reed. Yes, so okay.
Bravo, Catherine. Thank you. That was absolutely terrific. And it was such a wonderful opportunity to hear this fantastic work played so beautifully and compellingly. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Great. I wish we could all burst into, huge spontaneous applause, but those days will return soon. Uh, so, uh, what a fantastic program. Bach, Elliot Carter, and now Benjamin Britten. Three very different styles of writing, three different types of music, all performed by Katherine Bryer on the solo oboe, an extraordinary evening. Before we turn to questions from you, our audience, and there are a few that have come in, which is great, and we'll get to them in a minute. I just wanted to invite everyone and remind everyone about our very next music forum, which is on uncharacteristically a Thursday. It's Thursday, the 4th of March, so not too long from now, a little less than 2 weeks. And I'll be speaking with a good friend of mine, Jonathan Daw, a composer who will be joining us from New York, where he's based. He's on the faculty of Juilliard, and he and I have collaborated on a number of projects in the past. He's been commissioned by the Boston Symphony Orchestra in America and had work performed by them, a major orchestral work, and operas in Montreal. And he's been commissioned by us at the Arts Institute to write a couple of compositions. One will be at Theatre Royal Plymouth in May. He's one of the two composers who's written the musical score for Some Call It Home, which will be in early May at TRP. And then he's also been commissioned to write a new string quartet based on sketches of Beethoven for our Beethoven Festival, which many of you know has now been postponed till we can all be together live again in October. So just make a mental note, 4th of March, Jonathan Daw, great guy, wonderful conversationalist, wonderful composer. So let's turn to a couple of questions. Catherine, there are a few questions for you. The first one I'll just dive in, and it's from Bex L. What model of oboe are you playing on? And I guess who's the manufacturer? Who made your oboe?
I'm on a Marigot 901. So Marigot is a French make. Lots of people all over the world play on them, certainly in this country and in Europe, they're extremely popular. And 901 is just sort of the model within the make that I play on, yeah, with a plastic top joint.
Is that unusual to have the union of plastic and wood in a single instrument?
It's becoming more popular. I think there are still some people who don't like it, but there's pros and cons to it. I think it's personally, I didn't pick this oboe because of it having a plastic top joint. There was when I went to try different oboes, there was a whole load of them, some all wood, some with plastic top joints, and this was just the one I liked the most, regardless of that. So it means it doesn't, because oboes can crack when you get them new, because the wood expands as you play it, so they crack and you have to get them filled in, so they can change quite a lot. So mine hasn't changed since I bought it, which is one benefit. Yeah, so I like it. I'm a convert, I think.
Well, I think we can all attest that it sounds fantastic. So
thank you.
Okay, another question from Sue Cousins. What is the relationship between the development of the oboe and the chalumeau? That's something I'm not familiar with. Chalumeau.
Is that an Eastern European double reed instrument? I think, or is it in India? It's another double reed instrument, I think. I don't want to put my foot in it, but it's certainly a double reed instrument from different like musical tradition. That's as much as I know. So I think, I guess the similarity is the reed. They play on a double reed, so it's a sort of similar kind of sound with that. But I don't know enough about the other instrument to probably give that much of a comment on it. But I think if you look across, all through history and across all cultures, they have double reed wind instruments. I think it's something that's quite unanimous all over globally, which is this is just the sort of Western one that's developed, but there's lots in other cultures as well, I think, yeah.
All right, and then that leads to another question from Jeff Davis. He asked, is the oboe the only wind instrument with a reed? Now, of course, there are several ways of addressing that, but jump right in.
So it's not actually. There are two wind instruments that use a double reed, and when I say double reed, what I mean is there's like two sides. So there's that side and there's that side. It's made of a folded piece of cane. So the bassoon that's then been cut and you blow down it, and the bassoon also plays on a double reed. So they're very different. They're much bigger. I think they're a lot less resistant to play down. But that might be why you've noticed bassoon and oboe, like timbrally, they're not so dissimilar. It's obviously different pitch and everything, but they blend very well because of that double reed. But clarinets also play on a reed, but they just have a single reed. So they have like the mouthpiece and the reed gets strapped in here. So it's just one piece of reed vibrating here rather than two bits of reed vibrating. But then flute has no reed. Yeah.
Then of course, if we were to, we know that there's the contrabassoon, right? And the English horn. How different is the English horn from the oboe?
It is different. The fingerings are the same, so you play it the same way in terms of the pattern. I read a D, I play a D that's the same on the oboe, but it sounds a fifth lower. So if I played an A on the cor anglais, it would sound a D. Sorry, it was like, what's a fifth lower than A? It would sound a D. So when we tune, if I'm in an orchestra and I'm playing the cor anglais, I have to tune to an E because then that sounds the concert A. Right. And the reeds are completely different, which is another joy. So that's another sort of skill set that you need to learn, how to make cor anglais reeds. But in terms of playing, it does feel very different to play. It's a lot less resistant. You can sort of it speaks easier, and it is in some ways like easier to just blow down it, but it has different sort of problems to the oboe. They both have their own little issues, but yeah, it's a beautiful instrument. I do love the cor anglais.
Yeah, it's great. And I think we have time for one more question from Mariana in Plymouth. Did oboes exist in Bach's time, or when were they invented, roughly?
I think they've been around for a really long time. They certainly did exist in Bach's time because he wrote a lot. Even though the Bach I played as a flute piece, if you listen to his cantatas and his passions, there's incredible oboe writing. We're so lucky to have that music. And he did write some sonatas as well, like with continuo, that are originally for oboe. But I think oboe and the Baroque oboe is very different. I don't know if people have seen a Baroque oboe before, but it kind of looks like more like a recorder with the reed in it. So it's very different. And complete different fingerings. I can barely get a sound out of the Baroque oboe. But I think, I guess Bach's time is when it was undergoing a lot of development. But I think I don't know exact dates, but I think it has been around for a really, really long time, probably even several hundred years before Bach. But because I think it's a very early instrument. That and the flute, I think, are very early wind instruments.
Certainly Pan had one, right?
Pan had one, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, well, first of all, Katherine, thank you very, very much for a marvelous evening. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for sharing your musical talents and artistry with us. It's great.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice.
Absolute pleasure. And thank all of you for being with us as well. And we look forward to welcoming you to the next one soon. Have a good evening.